My name is Nir Zakovich. I'm the director of the Applied Ethics Center. Thank you all for coming out. We're very, very fortunate to have my colleague and my very good friend Jim Carroll with us today. Jim is an author and a journalist who's written numerous works of fiction and nonfiction, including An American Requiem that won the National Book Award, Constantine's Sword that won the Jewish Book Award, National Jewish Book Award, House of War that won the Penn Galbraith Award, and many other works of fiction and nonfiction. Jim and I go a long way back, and I've learned a great deal from him. In fact, in Hebrew, we have this expression, when you've learned from somebody not only substance and history and philosophy, but also how to behave in the world and how to be in the world and how to be a mensch and how to be a decent human being, you say that that person is not only your teacher, but your teacher and your rabbi. The Hebrew term is mori v'rabi. So please welcome my teacher and my rabbi, Jim Carroll.
So obviously I have to rewrite my resume and put I'm Nir Isakovitz Rabbi at the top of it. I'm honored to be a part of anything Nir does. I have admired Nir for a long time, and I'm thrilled to know of the center that he is initiating here at UMass Boston. I'm also deeply honored and thrilled to be here at UMass Boston, an institution as a Bostonian that I treasure and admire so much. And I envy all of you who are students or teachers here at UMass. Who loaded Trump's gun? A brief history of America's nuclear sin. It was simply one of the most stirring speeches an American president had ever given. The place was Prague. The year was 2009. The president was the recently sworn Barack Obama, and the promise he made that day is worth recalling at length. As the only nuclear power to have used a nuclear weapon, the United States has a moral responsibility to act. So today I state clearly and with conviction America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. I'm not naive. This goal will not be reached quickly, perhaps not in my lifetime. It will take patience and persistence. But now we too must ignore the voices who tell us that the world cannot change. We have to insist, yes, we can. President Obama had been in office only 3 months, and now, boldly claiming his place on the world stage, he was unequivocal in throwing in with a nuclear abolition movement that until now had belonged on the fringe of power politics. He went on to say, I know that there are some who will question whether we can act on such a broad agenda. There are those who doubt whether true international cooperation is possible. And there are those who hear talk of a world without nuclear weapons and doubt whether it's worth setting a goal that seems impossible to achieve. But make no mistake, we know where the road of nuclear weapons leads. The simple existence of nuclear weapons, an American president was saying, leads to perdition, to doom. Other, what you might call, apostles of realpolitik had already embraced the goal of nuclear elimination. The 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was a bargain between nuclear haves and nuclear have-nots, between states that possessed nuclear weapons, the handful, and the vast majority of states that did not have nuclear weapons. And the bargain said that those nations holding nuclear weapons promised to pursue, quote, effective measures in the direction of nuclear disarmament. And in return for that commitment to move toward nuclear disarmament, the other nations of the world agreed to forego the acquisition of nuclear weapons. That was the bargain. We won't pursue nuclear weapons while you work to achieve disarmament from nuclear weapons. But that was 1968. And in the decades since, the number of nuclear warheads first mushroomed beyond anybody's expectation of compilation. Nuclear weapons states ignored the second half of the so-called NPT treaty, and the crucial clause maintaining the eventual disarmament was all but forgotten. And then the Cold War ended, and nuclear weapons, which had been brought into existence in such numbers justified by the Cold War, nuclear weapons might have, at that point, gone the way of chemical weapons, which had long been banned by international agreement. If chemical weapons can be banned, why not nuclear weapons? And the moment of the end of the Cold War seemed to make that possible. But on the American side, Bill Clinton, who, as you recall, had made his first reputation as an opponent of war, presided over the 1994 Nuclear Posture Review, a review of nuclear strategy carried out by the Pentagon, which insisted, despite the end of the Cold War, on maintaining the U.S. nuclear arsenal at Cold War levels as a, quote, hedge against an imagined return of fascism in Russia, which at that point had seemed embarked on a precious process of democratization. The hedge, the Pentagon said, would be like an insurance policy in case things went wrong in Russia. But some critics said the insurance policy was the thing that would start the fire. In 1999, a chief architect of the U.S. nuclear mindset, Paul Nitze, who had across the decades been at the heart of the American military establishment, reversed his own lifetime obsession to denounce nuclear weapons as, quote, a threat mostly to ourselves. Nitze stunningly called effectively for unilateral disarmament in 1999. The United States should simply do away with its nuclear arsenal and lead the world down that path. In 2007, four what you might call high priests of the cult of nuclear weapons, George Shultz, former Secretary of State, William Perry, former Secretary of Defense, Henry Kissinger, who needs no introduction, and Sam Nunn, the former leading hawk in the U.S. Senate. Those four former nuclear high priests issued what amounted to a kind of sacrilegious renunciation. Quote, we endorse setting the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons and working energetically on the actions required to achieve that goal. But such figures had, you might say, come to Jesus after they left office, when they were exempt from the responsibility to match their high-flown rhetoric with the gritty work to make it real. It's what you might call retirement syndrome, once they were retired, they could embrace the moral high ground. But Obama was at the start of what would be an 8-year presidency. And his rejection of nuclear fatalism in that speech in Prague ran across the world. Only months later, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, I believe in large part because of this stunning commitment. The way in which the world responded to Obama's promise to end nuclear weapons is what got him the Nobel Peace Prize. A core hope of the post-World War II peace movement, which had always been marginal, was now embraced in the seat of power at last. And a year later, at President Obama's direction, the Pentagon, in its own nuclear posture review of 2010, embraced the president's position. The Pentagon embraced the president's position, committing itself, quote, to a multilateral effort to limit, reduce, and eventually eliminate all nuclear weapons worldwide. Folks, that's the Pentagon. The Pentagon's nuclear posture review promise in 2010 went on to say the United States will not develop new nuclear warheads, period. Regarding the future of the nuclear arsenal, it saw a program of what you might call responsible maintenance, but no breaking of new ground. Life extension programs, the Pentagon promised, will only use nuclear components based on previously tested designs and will not support new military missions or provide new military capabilities. Emphasizing again, that's the Pentagon in 2010. The timing of Obama's arrival was crucial. The weapons and delivery systems of the U.S. nuclear arsenal were aged by then. They were missiles, warheads, strategic bombers, and nuclear-powered submarines that dated to the early years of the Cold War, and they were effectively approaching their sell-by dates. The nuclear arsenal was so old that it was either going to have to be replaced or finished with. And under Obama, the first expectation was, my God, we can finish with it. Massive reductions in the arsenal had to be accomplished before pressures built for the wholesale replacement of the weapon system, which would necessarily involve innovations in technology and expansions of the lethality of the weapons, which would in effect reinvigorate a whole new arms race with other world powers. Finally, one of the world's nuclear powers, the U.S., seemed to be ready to take, as the NPT said in 1968, effective measures in the direction of nuclear disarmament. Obama was presiding over a golden moment and over an apocalyptic deadline. My friends, I'm describing a true moment of American tragedy, because three things happened then. Vladimir Putin resurfaced as the man in charge of the Soviet Union and as a man embarked on that dreaded new program of fascism in Russia. I said the Soviet Union. I meant Russia, of course. The second thing that happened was extremist Republicans took the U.S. Congress hostage in Washington. And Barack Obama, third, found himself lashed like Ahab to, as Herman Melville wrote, the monomaniacal incarnation of all those malicious agencies which some deep men feel eating in them till they are left living on half a heart and half a lung. the great white whale, surfacing once again as an image of the American dilemma. As President Obama's course reversals in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria would show, and as White House failures with a succession of secretaries of defense would emphasize, Obama's great white whale turned out to be the Pentagon itself, whose intangible malignity, in Melville's phrase, was steadily quickened by Putin and the Republicans both. It's as if Obama was double-teamed. And Obama's half-devoured heart shows in nothing so much as his retreat, both in rhetoric and in policy, from the goal of nuclear abolition. In 2010, his first great step toward arms reduction, the first great triumph of his presidency, was the New START treaty with Russia, a new arms reduction treaty with Russia. That treaty capped deployment of strategic nuclear warheads at 1,500. That was 2010. As of this fall, the United States deploys 1,393 to Russia's 1,561 strategic nuclear warheads, including stored but readily rearmed and retargeted weapons. The complete U.S. arsenal today stands at a total of about 4,800 nuclear weapons and another 2,800 so-called retired nuclear weapons. By the way, China's nuclear arsenal today stands at 270. Although Obama's total reduction of strategic nukes across his full 8 years, a total of 1,255 nuclear weapons eliminated under Obama, although that contrasts with the reductions of the two Presidents Bush, who together eliminated 14,801 nuclear weapons, Obama did indeed, as you see, succeed in matching the New START level of 1,500. He got there. But here's the catch. In order to get Republicans to vote to ratify the 2010 START Treaty, Obama agreed to a vast modernization of the U.S. nuclear arsenal, which in the name of updating an aged system has already morphed into a full-blown reinvention of the arms cache. The golden moment was gone. By now, the chicken of Obama's compromise has come home to roost. The Pentagon, having left behind that spirit of 2009 and 10, is now in league with the Republican Congress and the new super-aggressive presidential administration to effectively, across the last year, obliterate any hope of nuclear abolition. This is the tragedy. This past August, to take only one example, the United States Air Force, in violation of that 2010 Pentagon promise, announced new contracts for an unprecedented hyper-stealth nuclear cruise missile, a program that will cost more than $25 billion, resulting in the deployment of more than 1,000 new diabolical weapons. This missile, able to penetrate any and all Russian and Chinese defense systems, and which former Secretary of Defense William Perry therefore denounced as a profoundly destabilizing weapon, will certainly reignite the arms race that had in one of history's most precious turns all but cooled in recent years. As if that were not grave enough, in that same August announcement, the United States Air Force let contracts for the replacement of the 40-year-old Minuteman silo-launched ICBMs that salt the plains of the American Midwest and Northwest, a system of ground-based intercontinental ballistic missiles that until this year was on its way to being phased out. Ultimately, this reinvention of a wholly unnecessary ground-based nuclear weapons regime will cost more than $100 billion. We're starting it over. When there was a near consensus only 2 years ago that the Minuteman system had seen its day and was ready to be buried. Vladimir Putin, of course, is engaged in his own version of a nuclear modernization program, which now feeds ours. One need not imagine Russians as soft or peace-minded to know, however, that these post-Obama Pentagon initiatives are inevitably reinforcing the most hawkish impulses of Moscow's own nuclear priesthood. They have their nuclear priesthood too, and they are in their own way back. The context for the significance of the American move, followed now by the Russian move, is important. For the full 70 years of the nuclear age, and we Americans don't hardly ever look at this, it was the United States that led every step, every upward step of the arms race escalation. And that is happening again. Let me give you the brief summary. How the United States took a step and the Soviet Union followed in lockstep. In 1945, we developed the atomic bomb. The Soviet Union followed with an atomic bomb in 1949. In 1947, we developed the long-range bomber. In 1952, the Soviet Union developed a long-range bomber. In 1948, we developed the intercontinental ballistic missile. The Soviet Union achieved its intercontinental ballistic missile in 1955. In 1952, we exploded the hydrogen bomb. The Soviet Union followed with its hydrogen bomb in 1955. In 1960, we developed the sub-base ICBM. The Soviet Union followed with its sub-base ICBM in 1968. In 1964, the multiple warhead. The Soviet Union's multiple warhead, 1973. The MIRV in 1970 in the United States. In the Soviet Union, 1975. The cruise missile, 1977 in the United States. In 1980 in the Soviet Union. And after this summer's Pentagon announcement, you can be sure that that pattern will extend to the next generation of nuclear weapons that will guarantee the renewal of a nuclear arms race on into the indefinite future. And the worst of it is not even Russia. Once the heavyweights of the world's nuclear powers resume the full-bore pursuit of a reinvented nuclear arsenal, the cascade of nuclear proliferation, which the NPT has miraculously held mostly in check since 1968. The miracle of our lifetimes, mine and yours, is that today there are so few nuclear powers. Not that there are so many, but now the cascade will begin in earnest. Iran, yes, but also, surely, coming, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, why not? North Korea, sure. But South Korea, Japan, Australia, Brazil, Argentina, therefore, etc., etc., etc. After decades of movement in the other direction, that is, the United States of America, with its renewed nuclear arsenal, is taking the lead in what has to be called the abolition of nuclear abolition. You and I are among the first generation of human beings with the actual capacity to commit species suicide. And once again, having been given a reprieve from it, we are embarked upon that road to species doom. By now, you've probably noticed something. The title of my remarks today is, "Who Loaded Trump's Gun?" Hello? I haven't mentioned Donald Trump. Most of the way through the talk, relax. But I haven't mentioned Donald Trump. He has, of course, single-handedly brought back a level of global nuclear dread not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. He has thrown down the gauntlet with Kim Jong-un, daring the mercurial North Korean to a game of nuclear chicken that is still being played out. It's probably one of the reasons some of you are here. The possibilities for a nuclear miscalculation in this circumstance is part of what makes Trump's bluster so terrifying. But as is true with everything he touches, the level of his ignorance of nuclear realities is horrifying. To take only one example of its display, think back to that National Security Staff meeting he held in the Pentagon last July 20th. According to reliable news reports, later denied by blushing and unconvincing administration officials, Trump stunned the generals and his own most senior staffers by proposing, in the context of the recently reconstituted nuclear arsenal that I've already been describing, remember those announcements from last summer, Trump proposed that the number of nukes going forward should be capped not in the present low thousands, but at 32,000. That number matches the peak level of the late 1960s. And as experts pointed out after news of Trump's statement leaked, given present capacities, it would take 350 years to achieve the president's goal. It was this display of presidential ignorance that prompted Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, again according to reliable reports, unconvincingly denied, to characterize him as a fucking moron. Trump himself had defined the real danger in a campaign debate in 2015 when he said, quote, "The biggest problem we have is nuclear proliferation, and having some maniac, having some madman go out and get a nuclear weapon. That, in my opinion, is the single biggest problem that our country faces right now." Trump was right, of course. He is the madman. But not even that is the gravest problem. Recall my question, who loaded Trump's gun? Who? That loading is still going on. And the danger it poses transcends even the multiple dangers of Donald Trump. Trump is not the crime. Trump is the evidence. Evidence of what? Of the way in which for decades now, the United States of America, and therefore the world, has been taken hostage by that great white whale. All those malicious agencies at work, below the surface of American political life. Not the deep state that Steve Bannon derides, but the, in Eisenhower's immortal formulation, military-industrial complex. That combine of, again, Melville, malicious agencies has age in and age out, my whole lifetime, refused to yield its demonic power, no matter who commands. Trump is the nuclear white whale's plaything. But, and here is the warning, Obama was its declared enemy, and he was defeated by it. Even before that, the real measure of the nuclear monster's power had already been taken by Jimmy Carter, who also came into office with a rousing declaration of abolitionist purpose. His story is, if anything, an even starker emblem of the problem than Obama's. President Jimmy Carter was a Navy veteran, a former officer on a nuclear submarine, who came into supreme military authority with a rare awareness of the danger of the nuclear arsenal that he himself had firsthand experience of. He knew. In his inaugural address, he embraced the cause of nuclear abolition explicitly. But as president, Carter proved to be a sailor ignorant of the tide, unaware that the nuclear current was running against him. Unlike Trump, he was a self-proclaimed lover of peace. Yet by the time he left office, folks, listen to this. Here is the American tragedy in a nutshell. Jimmy Carter had introduced a new class of nuclear weapons, the neutron bomb, that does not destroy property, only people. He had initiated a major across-the-board arms buildup, for which Ronald Reagan would take credit. He had issued Presidential Directive 59, which expanded the number of nuclear targets to be hit in the Soviet Union from 1,700 to 7,000. He had ordered NATO's deployment of more than 500 Pershing II missile launchers and cruise missiles in Europe. And by the way, he had begun the financing and arming of an Afghani resistance group, soon to be known as Al-Qaeda. And in his final State of the Union address, he had promulgated the so-called Carter Doctrine, claiming, quote, access to Persian Gulf oil by any means necessary, including military force, unquote. Jimmy Carter, that is, initiated the wars of the 21st century, and he made sure that the nuclear leviathan would thrive into the open future. As if to honor the former president for these things, the Navy invited him in 2004 to preside over the christening of the USS Jimmy Carter, a Seawolf-class nuclear submarine, the most heavily armed submarine ever built. What will the Pentagon name for Barack Obama in thanks for his similar role in the care and feeding of the nuclear monster, despite himself, that the likes of Carter and Obama, lashed to the back of the thrashing whale, can be carried off by the maniacal nuclear militarism, shows what a demonic force it is. But despite the implications of Melville's imagery, that force is not superhuman, and it is not beyond the realm of moral responsibility, which is the preoccupation of the new ethics center that gathers us this afternoon. It is not beyond the realm of moral responsibility. Who set the monster loose? Who feeds it? Who owns it? For decades, this futile process has gone on with nuclear critics like me blasting away at the LeMays and McNamaras and Kissingers and Lairds and Reagans and Cheneys and Rumsfelds and Bushes and, yes, alas, Carters and Obamas. They have done this to us. They have set Trump up on his dangerous pinnacle, giving him the lawful authority and organizational power to, yes, and on his own impulse, initiate the extinction of the species. Who did this? But folks, the United States of America is a democracy, not a dictatorship. Responsibility for the actions of the American government do rest with the American people. We, the people, perhaps especially on the left, have consoled ourselves by laying blame off on our leaders who, era in and era out, are not worthy of us. They do not listen. They do not follow through. They do not stop the madness. But why? It's because we, the people, never force them to. We never force them to. Occasionally, as happened for a week or so last summer, when Trump seemed ready to nuke North Korea, we allow ourselves to feel a big dose of nuclear dread. That generated last summer a rare move in the Congress to revisit the American system of investing one man with ultimate nuclear authority, a revisiting that occurs pointedly today with Senate hearings. But who expects anything to come of that? No, nukes pose a problem because we blithely and mainly ignore it. A sleeping dog, we are content to let it lie. We cheer Obama when he promises to rid the world of nuclear weapons, but then when instead he lays the groundwork for their revitalization, we barely take notice. As happened before nearly 50 years ago with Jimmy Carter, same thing. We barely take notice. Yes, some dogged activists, including some people here in this room today, no doubt, have worked to raise nuclear awareness. Physicians, academics, former government officials, peace movement veterans. But the refusal of the Pentagon and its mavens to truly alter its nuclear course has almost never penetrated the American conscience. The early 1980s, with the powerful nuclear freeze movement, which brought 1 million protesters to the United Nations, was an exception that survives in memory mainly as a rebuke, since it shows that the nuclear question can be raised to the level of other pressing causes. Folks, think climate change, universal health care, the right to choose, Black Lives Matter, justice for Palestine, economic inequality, on and on. Where, oh, where on the list of our urgent commitments is the abolition of nuclear weapons? Where is it, even now, when the finger on the apocalyptic button belongs to the madman he himself warned us of? Where on the list of American concerns is the ultimate survival of the human species? It's hardly there at all. That's where. Guess what? Having grown weary of waiting for the United States to live up to its legal obligation under Clause 6 of that 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to pursue effective measures relating to the cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament, unquote, having given up on waiting for us and other nuclear powers to do that, the nations of the world are demanding more with real power right now. Last September, at the United Nations, representatives of more than 120 nations signed a new and urgent treaty to ban nuclear weapons as chemical weapons have been banned, at last. A number, of course, not including the United States. That treaty had been agreed to in July. Did you notice the UN signing ceremony in September? If you did, you were an unusual person. It took place not long before Donald Trump insulted the same United Nations forum by using it to belittle Kim Jong-un as Rocket Man. We did hear about that. The treaty, not so much. The global demand for a nuclear ban, not so much. Did the American press take note of this most urgent United Nations treaty? Not that I saw. Has the press taken note of the follow-on meeting underway by signatories to the treaty that's taking place in Rome today? Not that I see. Not really. Where is the political pressure anywhere, even on the left, attempting to put the cri de coeur of the very world that treaty represents before the American mind and conscience? It seems a harsh conclusion to draw. Forgive me if it offends you. But the politicians don't care about the nuclear threat, and the press doesn't care about the nuclear threat because the people don't. That is us, folks. Who loaded Trump's gun? We did. And on that happy note, I conclude. So, we have some time, I hope, for a little conversation. Objections, questions, clarifications, whatever you like. Yes, sir.
What can I do as a student, one person?
What can you do as one person?
Yeah, like, I really, wish to see a world without nuclear weapons as well.
Yeah.
So what is your advice?
Well, you can start by having come to this lecture. Hello. Since the title made it very clear what the subject was. But let me just tell you a quick story. Did you ever hear of Randall Forsberg? It's a name that should be known in American history. She was a graduate student. Are you a graduate student? Undergraduate? She was a graduate student across the river at MIT in the late 70s. She was moved by Jimmy Carter's commitment to nuclear abolition and was crushed by his failure to fulfill it. And in 1980, as Carter was leaving office, she drew up a one-page declaration. At that point, as with Carter, the movement in nuclear weapons was ever up. Escalation, the arms race was still heading up. And she wrote a one-page declaration. She was like you. What can I do? She wrote a one-page declaration calling for a freeze on the number of nuclear weapons that the great powers had. Not reduction, a freeze. And she got fellow graduate students. She was getting her PhD in national security studies, so this was her field. But she got her fellow graduate students and then a few faculty to sign this, and it turned into a petition. That was 1980. By 1981, that had ignited a national movement called the Freeze Movement that led to every group of, when dentists' conventions or the conventions of foresters or the conventions of real estate agents met in convention centers all over the country, somebody would get up at the convention and, is there any new business? Yes, I'd like to make a motion. Somebody would move that the convention go on record in support of the freeze. And suddenly, there was this mass movement that impacted the Congress. Congressman Ed Markey, newly elected congressman with everything to lose, sponsored the freeze in the House of Representatives and shocked everybody when it passed. It was sponsored in the Senate by Ted Kennedy. Ed Markey is one of us. Ed Markey, by the way, sponsored the bill that is being debated today about changing the way in which the American president has sole authority over nuclear weapons. You can vote for Ed Markey if you're in his district. Ed Markey, across the decades. The freeze movement eventually affected Ronald Reagan, so that by the time Mikhail Gorbachev began to propose in 1985 and 86 an end to the upward escalation of the arms race, Ronald Reagan, no peacenik, felt the pressure from below and began to change his mind. And he was the one who turned the freeze against itself by saying, I'm not in favor of the freeze, I want reduction. So the tradition of arms limitation, SALT, strategic arms limitation, the early days of the peace negotiation were SALT talks. SALT talks gave way to START talks, strategic arms reduction talks. The freeze movement turned the corner from upward mobility to reduction and ultimately enabled Ronald Reagan to say yes to Mikhail Gorbachev, which led, against the expectation of all of the nuclear hawks, to a nonviolent end of the Cold War. I would argue that turn in the human story, the most precious thing in my lifetime, began with a person like you sitting in a chair like that saying, what can I do? She wrote a one-page declaration. Everybody, Google Randall Forsberg, or Google the freeze movement, or Google the freeze resolution. It can be done. I said in my remarks, the freeze lives on as a kind of rebuke to us because we're not doing it. Where are we? Where was the support that Obama needed to push back against the Republican demand? If you want us to approve the new START treaty with Russia, we want this in return. We want this revitalization of the nuclear arsenal. Where was the Democratic Party? Who pushed back against that? Who supported Obama and his wish to go down the road of abolition? He stopped talking about it because there was no public demand for it. Other comments or questions? Do you want to respond? No? Are you feeling empowered? Other comments or questions? Objections?
Hi, Professor. You just mentioned about Vladimir Putin as the leader of the Soviet Union, not Russians. So will you still keep in mind of the Cold War? You do keep the thought of the Cold War, and you also mentioned about China also hold a lot of the nuclear head. So the Trump just finished his trip to the Asians. And what do you think about the nuclear policy of China? Will China be the second super nuclear power as USSR? Yeah, thank you very much.
So do I understand correctly that you'd like me to comment on China and its approach to nuclear weapons? I'm no expert on China, but I will say this. I think the Chinese, like the North Vietnamese, like the Iranians, I would also say like Russia, even despite Putin, they're all responding to pressures that, in my opinion, are generated in the United States. China has to develop an ICBM capacity to hit the United States. North Korea has to attempt to develop an ICBM capacity to hit the United States. Why? Because it's been very clear, the record is very clear, that the United States is committed to changing the regimes of countries it has power over. And the only power that stops American intervention is nuclear power. And, the obvious case in point is the story of Muammar Gaddafi, who had a nuclear weapons program and gave it up and was overthrown and killed. And Kim Jong-un gets the picture, and so do the people in Iran. China has its own strategic impulses and its own imperial ambitions, quite clearly. We don't have to be naive about it, but the United States of America, as I argued in my little chronology of years, the United States of America, from the get-go of the nuclear age, has been in a position to take the lead. And a serious American commitment to disarmament would have implications for the whole world, including China. That's my opinion. Now, someone who's a little more realpolitik than me could push back readily on that and argue that, well, if we let go of our nuclear weapons arsenal, we'd be at the mercy of the totalitarian and fascist impulses of other countries. But, as Obama did, to argue that abolition is an attainable goal and that the road to it can be moved along fairly quickly, that's not the same thing as just eliminating the nuclear arsenal overnight. It's about a gradual building of trust among the nuclear weapons powers, not all of whom, but China is a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So is Iran, by the way. North Korea is not. Let's see what this world treaty that the United Nations was the site of this summer, leads to. But our only hope is a change in the imagination right now of the American people. And what can do it for us is we can be frightened into it, although we're having a little bit of ADD because our fear of last summer, when for a week people were talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis as the last time the world had seemed to be on the edge of a nuclear war, our attention was taken away immediately by other large events, the mass murder in Las Vegas or the tragic hurricanes that hit Texas, Florida, and most tragically, Puerto Rico. And then, of course, the genius of our president, who has a way of every 2 or 3 days of generating another sort of large critical question that takes our eye away from the thing we thought we were about to take seriously. And that has happened. It's instructive to us. What happened? How many people here remember being somewhat concerned about nuclear war with North Korea last summer? Where did that concern go for us? It's become part of the routine. Any other comment? Yes, sir. I invite anyone in the room, especially anyone who's more attuned to the Bernie Sanders campaign and platform than I am, to tell me when and where Bernie Sanders addressed nuclear abolition. I'm sure he's in favor of it. I'm sure he's in favor of it. It's a common sense position. I'm certain he's in favor of it. Did he address it in the political campaign? Did he make an issue of it in relation to Hillary Clinton, who probably isn't a nuclear abolitionist? I don't know. But why wasn't that issue forced? Why wasn't the question forced? The fact that Bernie Sanders has no discernible position on nuclear abolition is a signal of the problem. It's a signal of the problem. Climate change, the crisis of climate change, is the second most threatening problem facing the human species. But we won't have time to suffer the rise in the ocean levels if there's a massive nuclear exchange. Which is, of course, I think why, it's part of why it isn't on our agenda. It's just too horrible to contemplate. And it's more horrible now than ever when you realize that the American constitutional system protects the right of one person to initiate a potentially world, or not world, but civilization-ending exchange of nuclear weapons, that the American system puts that power in the hands of one person is beyond imprudent. It's beyond insane. And Senator Flake and the other senators are considering this today because the legislation has been proposed. Pay attention to what happens in that hearing. Let's hope something comes of it. maybe President Trump will frighten us into dealing with this, in which case he'd be a world historic figure for good. Who'd have guessed? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. I can hear embedded in your question a kind of comment, which is this is really not going to happen, right? No?
All of us want to assume it's not going to happen,
Yeah.
but like I believe almost every day, like I'm driving my car, I'm like, what if he just gone now, and I'm in my car and this is where I die?
Yeah, right.
Yes, it's definitely a possibility.
Yeah.
I wish I didn't have to, but let's say you did remove him as our president, would that calm anyone down at all? Would it calm North Korea down? Would it
Yeah.
calm Russia down?
Yeah.
Infuriate Russia to respond? What would happen?
Right. Well, I have no more wisdom on this than you do, but I would just make a couple of points. One is, when we talk about impeachment, of the various charges that could be brought against President Trump that are impeachable, I think the most urgent is his clear and cavalier attitude toward nuclear weapons, the readiness with which he threatens nuclear use, which sets up dynamics in enemies, especially in North Korea and Iran, that could be catastrophic, but also the profound level of ignorance that he displays. These are if there was nothing else about him, those are impeachable. Those are gross violations of the obligation of the President of the United States. The second thing I would observe is, I'm no particular fan of Vice President Pence. He's an arch conservative, I'm not, and he has positions that I find frightening and appalling. I do not believe that Vice President Pence is as ignorantly reckless when it comes to the exercise of American power as President Trump is. And that alone would make me relieved to have Pence succeed Trump, even though in almost every other way imaginable, I think of it as catastrophic too. But I do believe that Trump is a serious danger, especially in the way in which he's challenged the leader of North Korea, and the way in which now you can sense it. I don't have the information. I think a year from now we may have the information that Japan and South Korea are, I'm sure, seriously embarked on crossing the nuclear threshold themselves. You can bet that both of those nations have nuclear weapons programs, and they've carried them so far. You can bet that. And I'm sure that they're both quickly moving to cross the nuclear threshold themselves, which will also be catastrophic, because that opens the floodgate of nuclear proliferation. And once there are not 9, but a dozen or 20 or 25 nuclear weapons powers in the planet, there's no way we're going to avoid nuclear war. And the immediate escalation of nuclear weapons, these new cruise missiles, these new nuclear cruise missiles that the Air Force has now embarked upon, are a terrifying escalation of the power of nuclear weapons. And they're cheap, relatively, and they're easy to build, relatively. And there's no way Argentina is not capable of having such a fleet of weapons drones. So, maybe time for one more comment or question? Yes, sir.
Actually, I was going to say that no one good enough is going to run for president. So what do we do to actually completely take nuclear weapons out of the equation? Because the thing is, just like you stated, we voted for Trump. Not we, Americans voted for Trump. But we didn't think what would happen once Trump came into power. And now he's doing all of these things, and all of us want to impeach him. But who do we vote for? Who do we make our president? Who do we trust to take care of us and maybe think about other countries as well, not to go on a full-scale nuclear war?
Well, you know, it's a very powerful statement. I welcome it. For me, at this point, it isn't a question of who do we vote for. My question is, how do we Americans get the question of nuclear weapons, the danger they pose, and the possibility at last of abolition back on the public political agenda? That's the question. Meetings like this are part of the answer, a small part, admittedly, but a part of the answer. And we're at the beginning of a political season. In little more than a year, we're going to be full bore into the 2018 election, and by then, a year from now, the presidential election will be underway, presuming that we're still here, presuming that the worst hasn't happened, which is a larger presumption now than it used to be. And nuclear abolition has to get back on the agenda. I would make a prediction. Remember, I talked about the retirement syndrome? Kissinger and Schultz and Perry and Nunn and people like that suddenly getting the wisdom to be opposed to nuclear weapons. Paul Nitze, one of the architects of American nuclear strategy, actually proposed unilateral disarmament before he died. I would predict that President Obama is going to get religion on nuclear abolition again. Retirement syndrome. I hope he does. He could be a tremendous advocate. He could be a tremendous advocate because he's already on record as authentically wishing for it. And he could actually, you know, unlike President Clinton was never a nuclear abolitionist. Obama was the third president to be a nuclear abolitionist. The first was Carter. Guess who the second one was? Ronald Reagan, because of Randy Forsberg. By the time Ronald Reagan left office, he was doing his best to end the scourge of nuclear weapons. You remember the story of Reykjavik when Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan had the meeting? Google this, too. You should remember, you should know this if you don't. Gorbachev and Reagan agreed in principle in 1986. Maybe it was 87. I'm almost certain it was 86. Agreed in principle to the entire elimination of the nuclear arsenals on both sides, Soviet Union, America, by the year 2000. It makes me want to weep. Reagan leaned back at one point when they were debating the arcane question of how many weapons to reduce. You reduce that, I'll reduce this, you reduce that. Reagan leans back and says, golly, Mikhail, I wish we could just get rid of the whole damn thing, or some words to that effect. And Mikhail said, well, you're in charge of the United States, I'm in charge of the Soviet Union, why don't we? To which Reagan said, good point. And they agreed in principle. And it was when they left the room and their aides, George Shultz on the American side and various Soviet figures on the Soviet side, nearly had a heart attack. And they began to make it clear why it couldn't happen. It might have happened. It might have happened. Nuclear weapons belong on the public preoccupation of the American people. That's the simple point. And we are not Nazi Germany. We are a democracy where what happens belongs to us. Our Congress is approving a new defense budget that is the highest in history, way beyond proportionately what was appropriated during the Cold War, when there was a serious nuclear competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. And that is not on the American mind. So the great white whale thrashes on. We need a Randy Forsberg. Maybe one of you is the new Randy Forsberg. I hope so. Nir, I want to thank you very much for the privilege of being here. I really... I salute the center that you've inaugurated and look forward to following your commitment to changing the way in which American public policy is discussed. Thank you, folks.